Hello, everybody. We are just going to first start with doing protocol, and that is presenting tobacco. So I'd like to present Cynthia and Mike Young with tobacco for sharing their knowledge and their culture teachings and their personal experiences. We thank you for facilitating the blanket exercise today, and we are truly grateful to be a part of it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, and I ask you to pray for us. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just going to pray in my language. I speak a little bit different than the local First Nations around here because I'm from eastern Saskatchewan. But for the most part, they all understand me anyway. So we'll just bow our heads.
I would just like to thank everyone for coming today. About 2 weeks ago, I believe it was, I touched base with Cynthia and said that with Truth and Reconciliation Day coming soon, I would like to do something that would make an impact in our community. I had the opportunity to work with the Chamber of Commerce back in July on a blanket exercise, and it has not left me yet, and I don't believe that it ever will leave me. And it was so emotional that when we were looking for ways to spread the word for truth and reconciliation and what this means for our country, I asked Cynthia if she would be available. I asked her at 11 o'clock in the morning. By 4 o'clock, I'm sure she had the whole thing planned. So I'd like to thank the Chamber of Commerce, because without the Lloydminster Chamber of Commerce, we would not be here. They have arranged with Cynthia this entire event. I'd like to thank the Lloydminster Catholic School Board and the school system for allowing Cynthia to be here. They gave her the afternoon off so that she could be here today as well. I'd like to thank the Lloydminster Exhibition because they gave us this room to use today at no charge, and that means a lot to us as well. So we are excited to have you here. We are filming the entire blanket exercise, and I'm going to let Cynthia explain more about this exercise. But I want to really sincerely thank all of you for taking the afternoon to be with us. And I hope you get as much out of this as I got out of it and how it has stuck with me. I truly believe it will stick with you.
Hi.
I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. So thank you for gathering today with us. The Lloydminster Chamber of Commerce acknowledges that we are on Treaty 6 territory, the ancestral and traditional territories of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, Dakota, Sioux, as well as the Métis. We acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuits whose footsteps have marked these lands for generations. We are gathered for traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today, and for those who have started on their next journey. We recognize the lands as an act of reconciliation and gratitude for those territories we reside on and we are visiting.
Good. I think I have a big enough voice. I won't need the microphone. But the simulation you're about to take part in is in contribution and understanding of the colonization we now know as Canada, Turtle Island. It's impacted its Indigenous people who lived here long before settlers arrived from across the sea. This is how relationship our relationship has been damaged and why reconciliation is needed. The RTC, the Reconciliation Commission of Canada, Kairos Canada, and the Legacy of Hope Foundation is the one that put this blanket exercise together. So as you see the blankets arranged on the floor, it's representative of the land of Canada before people came from across the sea. And to play a part, you're going to step onto the blankets. Everybody has a scroll. Everybody has their trading things, because when people first came from across the sea, we had a really good partnership. And we took care of each other, and we showed them how to gather the animals. I always tell kids, if we go to Africa, who here knows how to take care of a giraffe? Let alone all those neck bones that giraffe has. So we'd have to find a local to help us and teach us about those things. And that's what the union was when people from across the sea first came. So you'll play a part, you'll step onto the blankets, and this exercise may bring up some difficult feelings, but at the end we're going to have an opportunity to talk about those things and share your feelings in a respectful way. So now we're going to start, and we're going to start by stepping on the blankets. Okay. So do you want to be the narrator, or I will?
You will.
Okay.
Yeah. You have a pen already, don't you?
Oh, I do.
Yeah, this is
so,
for the...
okay, they can hear me? Okay. So, these blankets represent the northern part of Turtle Island, or what we now know as Canada. This was a time before the arrival of Europeans. You represent the Indigenous people. The people have been here for at least 10,000 years, long before the arrival of Europeans. Turtle Island was our home, and home to millions of people like you. You lived in the nations. Each community had its own language, its own culture, its own traditions, laws, and government. There was a lot of communal support with everybody looking out for one another. Each of you had a distinct role to play, with men hunting and fishing, distributing the food to the community, and women taking care of the home life. Kids would also help out, and they learned from the elders herbs used for traditional medicine and healing. Stories, traditional knowledge are shared, crafts and good are traded, and there are many marriages between the nations. Each and every one of you knows the importance of the land, and you understand your relationship with it. Please take time to walk around freely with the blankets. Use and occupy your land as if you're living on it. Greet one another, shake hands. Trade your traditional items. Continue to walk freely and trade. Don't trade your babies. Yeah. Perfect. Perfect. Okay, we can stop trading and stand on the blankets. There's no occupancy here, okay? Read scroll number 1.
One of my favorite things about my culture is how we're taught that everything on earth is to be respected. It's an important part of the culture and covers everything. That includes respecting yourself. Respecting yourself is one of the most important things my culture has taught me. Also, the land, water, plants, air, and animals are all very important to our culture and need to be respected. Without any of it, what would we be? Qatari, Mohawk youth from Quebec.
As communities, you work together and you cooperate with one another. You end disputes by making treaties with other nations. The land is very important to you. All your needs, your food, your clothing, your shelter, your culture, your spirituality are taken by the land, are taken off of the land, which represented here are the blankets. In return, you take very seriously the responsibility to take care of the land. To the east, first I have to introduce my European settler. Kurt's going to read that part for us. Mike's going to be the one walking around taking care of everything. And Tanisha's also going to be on hand here. To the east, this way, we have our European who has arrived. Things were starting to happen in Europe in the late 1400s that would mean a huge change for all of you. In 1493, the King and Queen of Spain asked Pope Alexander to make a statement that would help Spain's explorers when they arrived in the lands. The statement is now called the Doctrine of Discovery, and this is what it said.
According to the Doctrine of Discovery, nations that are not Christian cannot own the land. The indigenous peoples living on the land will be put under the power of the Christian nations that believe to have discovered their lands.
And so began the so-called European discovery of Turtle Island. Please read scroll 2. Go to Terry Lynn.
The DNA Act was drafted in part to provide policy teeth for Sir John A. Macdonald's announcement that Canada's goal was to do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indian people in all respects with inhabitants of the Dominion. The Act specified how Indigenous people were put under protection of the Crown. It's provided the legal base for treaties and emphasized the government's central policies of assimilation, enfranchisement, and civilization.
When the Europeans first arrived on Turtle Island, there were many more Indigenous people than Europeans. The newcomers depended on you for their survival. And you helped them to understand how to do things, how you taught your children, how you took care of people who were sick, and how you lived off the land in a way that left enough for future generations, and how your governments worked. In the beginning, there was lots of cooperation and support between you and the settlers. The settlers and their leaders recognized you as the first peoples, and having your own government, laws, and territories, they recognized you as an independent nation. They made agreements and treaties with you. These treaties explained how you were going to share the land, the water, the animals, and the plants.
In the Royal Proclamation of 1763, King George III said, "Indigenous nations own their lands." The king said that the only legal way newcomers could gain control of those lands was by making treaties between the two nations.
Later on, the Government of Canada was formed, and the Royal Proclamation became part of Canadian law. The Royal Proclamation is a document that set out guidelines for European settlement of Aboriginal territories in what is now North America. However, the Royal Proclamation explicitly states that Aboriginal title has existed and continues to exist, and that all land would be considered Aboriginal land until seized by treaty. For you, the Indigenous people, the treaties were very special and sacred agreements. They were statements of peace, friendship, sharing. They were based and respected with honesty. These treaties are very important because they are the agreements between you and the kings and queens of countries in Europe. They made these agreements with you because you were there first, and the land belongs to you, and you had your own governments. The treaties officially recognized your power and independence as nations. The Europeans understood they could not force their laws or way of life on your people, who were here long before they arrived. They understood that you had rights, but the Europeans didn't see it that way anymore. They now had a different view of the treaties. For them, the land was something that could be bought and sold, and the treaties were a way of getting you, the Indigenous people, to give up your land.
Begin to slowly fold the edges of the blankets, making the blanket space smaller and smaller. When blankets are empty, you can take them away and put them in a pile outside the activity. Very gradually fold and remove blankets until the middle of the exercise when the Indian Act is introduced.
Don't run out of land yet, it didn't happen that fast. Yeah. I just want to remind you, do not step off the blankets. The goal is to stay on the blankets even as they get smaller. You, the Indigenous people, have always resisted when somebody has tried to take the land away. Please read scroll number 3.
Can you hold on a second? She's going to bring a mic over.
Where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. Where community is to be formed, common memory must be created. George Erasmus, Dene Nation, co-chair of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples.
After a while, you didn't get along very well with the Europeans. When the War of 1812 ended, the Europeans no longer needed you to help them with the fighting. As the fur trade dried up, the Europeans, the newcomers, turned more and more to farming and started looking for more land. Before too long, there were more Europeans than Indigenous people. One reason for this was the disease the Europeans brought with them. Diseases such as smallpox, measles, and tuberculosis. You, the Indigenous people, suffered badly from these diseases because you've never had them in your communities before. Millions of you died. In fact, there were so many people who died. Half the Indigenous people alive died from those diseases. In some communities, 9 out of 10 people died.
I give you this blanket. Blankets such as this were intentionally infected with the deadly smallpox virus and were given or traded to the Indigenous people by military leaders such as Jeffrey Amherst. You represent the many Indigenous people who died from smallpox after having come into contact with such blankets. Please step off the blanket and go sit down.
Yes.
Raise your hand if you have a white index card. Please step off the blankets. You represent those who died of various diseases. Please be silent for a moment to remember those who died from this disease.
You represent the Beatsok, one of the original people of what is now the island of Newfoundland. You also died from diseases you had never seen before because the Europeans overhunted. Some of you starved. Some of you died in violent encounters with the settlers trying to take your lands. Some of you were hunted down intentionally and killed in 1829. The last person recognized by the Europeans as your people, Shana Deetdi, died in St. John's. Your language and culture became extinct. Please step off the blankets.
I'm here in the south. I have to pick 2 people. You represent the Blackfoot Confederacy, who became divided when the border between the United States and British Canada was created. This border divides communities and cuts you off from one another. Please move to separate blankets. You need your rope.
This rope symbolizes the United States border.
Oh. Okay, good. Good. On July 1st, 1987, Canada became a nation and the Government of Canada was formed. Later on, the Royal Proclamation became a part of Canada law. On August 23rd, 1876, Treaty 6 was created. It was signed by the Cree, Saulteaux, Nakota, and Dene, who were going hungry due to the overhunting of the buffalo, and they were getting sick because of the European diseases. It was signed at Fort Pitt, Fort Carleton, and many chiefs were present at the signing, including Chief Sweetgrass, Mistawasis, and Atatagoop. Treaty 6 stretches over both Saskatchewan and Alberta and is the only treaty that includes the medicine chest, which is viewed as universal health care. It also includes the promise of education, which leaders saw as something that generations to come would need. The next text of the treaty states that BAM members would receive the following: reserve land in the amount of 1 square mile per family of 5, an annual cash payment at the rate of $25 per chief, $15 per headman, and $5 for any other band member, and a one-time present of $12 for each member of the band who agreed to the treaty. Twine and ammunition are a value of $1,500 per year. For each band and family, certain agricultural implements such as spades, livestock, horse, and wagon. A school once the people were settled on the reserve. The right to pursue hunting, trapping, and fishing. A medicine chest to keep the house of the Indian agent on the reserve. Rations were to be given in times of pestilence and famine. During the first 3 years after treaty was taken, the First Nations who settled on reserves and were farming were to receive $1,000 in agricultural provisions. Here's our train tracks. For you, the Indigenous people, the treaties are special and sacred agreements. The spirit and intent of the treaty is based on peace, friendship, and sharing, as well as respect and honesty. But the Europeans didn't see it that way anymore, and they now have a different view of treaties. For them, the land is something that can be bought and sold. The treaties are a way of getting you, the Indigenous people, to give up your land.
In 1881, construction begins on Prime Minister John A. Macdonald's dream of the Canadian Pacific Railway. This opens up the prairies to settlers. Land was needed for farming, and the Government of Canada bought a huge piece of land from the Hudson's Bay Company. This was very hard for some of you who were already living there, such as the Métis, the Cree, and the Blackfoot. You, the Métis, fought for your land during the Red River Rebellion and the Northwest Resistance. You won some of these battles, but in the end, you were defeated by the government's soldiers. Leaders such as Poundmaker and Big Bear are imprisoned, and Métis leader Louis Riel is hanged for treason for participation in the 1885 resistance. Cree War Chief Wandering Spirit, along with 7 other warriors, are tried without legal counsel, and they are hanged at Fort Battleford for their role in the resistance. This has been recognized as Canada's largest legal mass execution. Witnesses in attendance include First Nation students from the nearby Battleford Residential School. You represent the Métis leaders who died in battle, were put in jail, or were executed. Please step off the blanket.
After these rebellions, the Métis people entered a period of dispersion, fearing for their lives. Métis people changed their names and fled in all directions, some moving to the United States, and others went back to their First Nations families and became treaty Indians. Others denied their native heritage altogether. These were dark times for the Métis, a time of persecution and extreme poverty due to the landlessness and general lack of education. Inuit communities were moved to isolated, unfamiliar, barren lands and often had very bad results. One of these was tuberculosis, which reached northern communities by the 1950s. By 1956, 1/7 of the entire Inuit population was being treated for tuberculosis, while 1/3 of the overall was affected. Many children were removed from their homes to be treated for the TB in sanatoriums, such as the Albertine Sanatorium and the Charles Camsell Sanatorium of Edmonton. Some never to return. A large number of infected individuals passed away from the disease. Currently, the rate of TB among the Inuit is 284 times higher than any other Canadian non-born Aboriginal people. Elder Mary Wood from Saddle Lake Cree Nation shared with us her personal story while in residential school when she was diagnosed with tuberculosis and spent 3 years at Charles Camsell Hospital. She did not return home to the school during these 3 years until she was cured. During this time, she further lost her connection to her family and was no longer able to speak her Cree language.
You represent the people like the Inuit and the Innu at Davis Inlet, along with many other Indigenous communities who suffered and sometimes died because you were forced to move to an unfamiliar place. Please move your blanket away, fold it very small, and stand on it.
Raise your hand if you have a blue card. Please step off the blanket. You people represent those who died of hunger after being forced off your original land and away from your hunting grounds.
As more of us arrived, we needed more land. Many of us, as Europeans, thought we were better than the other kinds of people, including you. Soon, we didn't think of you as friends and partners, but as a problem to be solved. We started ignoring
or changing your laws to make it easier for us to take your land. Some land was taken in war, and some land was taken after you died.
In the Edmonton region, a businessman named Frank Oliver starts up Alberta's first newspaper called the Edmonton Bulletin. Mr. Oliver thinks that the nearby Passachase Reserve is a black eye for the settlement of Edmonton, and that it is bad for business. He uses his newspaper to voice his personal opinions on the subjects, which include the land being needed by better men. As a result of propaganda, pressure from government and church officials, and from the failure of the government to live up to its treaty promises, the Passachase people are forced to surrender the reserve. The surrender comes under highly questionable circumstances, and many believe that it is an illegal surrender.
As Indigenous people, you lost more than your land, because the land is so important to you. When it was taken away, some of you lost your way of living, your culture, and in some cases, your reason to live. Please read scroll number 4.
Terra Nullius. Terra Nullius. The idea of Terra Nullius, which in Latin means empty land, meant European countries would send out explorers, and when they found land, they would claim it for their nation. These were often lands we were using.
The land wasn't empty, and we as Europeans knew it. So we changed the idea to include lands not being used by civilized peoples or lands not being put to civilized use. It was us who decided what it meant to be civilized. And we decided that because you and your people were not using the land in a civilized way, we could take it, and it was almost impossible to stop us.
Please read scroll number 5.
The DNA British North American. The B&A British North American Act, also known as the Constitution Act, 1867, put Indians and lands reserved for Indians under the control of the federal government. When this happened, we lost our rights and control of our lands.
This law gave control of our lands to the Government of Canada, which at that time was up of only people from Europe. You, the Indigenous people, were not involved in the creation of this law that would have such a big impact on your lives. More and more, the plan was to try and make you like Europeans. Scroll number 6, please.
The Indian Act. In 1876, all the laws dealing with us were gathered together and put in the Indian Act. The Indian Act completely changed our lives. As long as our cultures were strong, it was difficult for the government to take our lands, so the government used the Indian Act to attack who we are as people. Hunting and fishing were now limited, and our spiritual ceremonies like the potlatch, powwow, and Sundance were now against the law. This didn't change until the 1950s.
Now hear this. According to the Indian Act of 1876 and the British North American Act of 1867, you and all of your territories are now under the direct control of the Canadian federal government. You will now be placed on reserves. Please fold your blankets until they are just large enough to stand on.
You went from being a strong, independent First Nation people with your own governments to an isolated, poor bands that depended on the government for almost everything. You were treated like you knew nothing, like you couldn't run your own lives. You became the responsibility of the federal government. Through the Indian Act, the federal government continues this day to deny you your basic rights. These rights are things most Canadians take for granted, such as healthy schools, proper housing, and clean running water.
You may not leave your reserve without a permit. You may not vote. You may not get together to talk about your rights. You may not practice your spirituality or your traditional forms of government. If you do any of these things, you may be put in jail.
Please read scroll number 7.
I know what the government did in the past. They said where we had to live. I know that we're not treated equally now, because I can feel it. We're all Canadians, and we should all be treated equally. Cassie, a Micmac youth from a community in Nova Scotia.
The Indian Act also tried to stop Indigenous people for fighting to keep their land. For example, under the Indian Act, it was against the law to raise money for your land rights in the courts until the 1950s. Please read scroll number 8.
Enfranchisement. Under the federal government policy, all First Nations people who became doctors, teachers, lawyers, soldiers, or who went to university lost their legal Indian status. This was called being granted enfranchisement.
In other words, the government would no longer legally recognize you as a First Nation person because you attended post-secondary or joined the military. This cut you off from your communities.
You were enfranchised. Because you attended post-secondary and became First Nations teachers, lawyers, or doctors, or you joined the military and are a veteran, so you lost your Indian status. You have left your community. Please step off the blanket and find a spot on the floor.
Please read scroll number 9.
Assimilation. The government thought the Indian problem would solve itself as more and more Indigenous people died from disease and others became part of a larger Canadian society. As one government employee said, the government's goal was to continue until there's not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and that there's no Indian problem and no Indian department. Indian Affairs Deputy Superintendent Duncan Campbell Scott.
You had become more like the Europeans by giving up your rights, farming, going to school, and praying in church like us. Even when you were finding success as a farmer on your reserve, the government creates a new policy to make it more difficult for you to succeed. One of these policies is the 1889 pheasant farming policy. This policy forces you to use simple handheld implements on small parcels of land, which severely limit your production. The policy is created to protect the livelihood and incomes of the European settlers, as many of you as Indigenous people are having more success than them from farming. Also around this time, the Pass the Permit system is introduced, which has devastating effects on the First Nations farming and is blamed for the failure of your farming initiatives. The Pass system comes into effect during and after the 1885 Riel resistance to monitor and restrict the freedom of First Nations people. It gives the Indian agents and farm instructors great power in the flow of goods and out of the reserve, where First Nations farmers have to obtain permits to sell their goods. Sometimes permits are granted or are granted too late to cause the goods to rot. Scroll number 10.
Residential schools. From 1820 until the 1970s, the federal government took First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children from our homes and communities and put them in boarding schools that were run by churches. The official partnership between the federal government and the churches ended in the 1970s, but some churches continued to operate schools until the 1990s. As parents, we didn't have a choice about this. Sometimes the police arrived to take away our children, and these schools were often very far from our homes, and they had to stay at them all or most of the year. Mostly they were not allowed to speak our languages, and they were punished if they did. Often our children weren't given enough food. The last band-controlled Indian residential school closed in 1996.
John A. MacDonald states, in order to educate this child properly, we must separate them from you. We must separate them from their families. They will be stripped of their culture and forbidden to speak their traditional language. They will not remember who they are. We will take the Indian out of them.
All the people with yellow cards, raise your hand. You must now move to the empty blanket far away with the dolls. Where did you put the dolls, Michael? You represent those people who were taken out of your communities and placed in residential schools, far from your homes, far from your culture, and far from your families. While some students say they had a positive experience at the schools, most of you say you suffered from very bad conditions and from very different kinds of abuse. Upon the arrival at schools, you were required to exchange your clothing for school-issued clothing, and you were issued a number to identify your clothing and you as well. Your hair was then cut short. Older brothers and sisters were separated from younger brothers and sisters. Brothers and sisters were separated from each other, and they along were rarely allowed to speak to each other. You went from eating your nutritious food that your parents hunted for, fished, harvested, gathered, to eating food that had little to no value. Quite often the school staff ate very well, while you were left hungry and malnourished. The schools were often poorly constructed, which made for dangerous conditions, which led to various health conditions for students. Many of you lost your family connections because you didn't learn your language, your culture, or your traditions. You grew up in the school, you barely went home, and many of you never learned how to be good parents. Some students died at those schools. Many of you never returned home and had trouble retaining if you did.
The person with the yellow index card marked with an X.
Ooh.
Please step off the blanket. You represent one of the thousands of children who died at the schools or who died later as a result of your experience.
Letters were often sent home to your parents, to parents who were unable to read and write. They only understood their language. Here is an example of one letter sent home before Christmas break from the Kamloops Indian Residential School. November 18th, 1948. Dear parents, it will be your privilege this year to have your children spend Christmas at home with you. The holidays will extend December 18th to January 3rd. This is a privilege which is to be granted if you observe the following of the Indian Department. The transportation to the home and back to the school must be paid for by the parents. The parents must also come themselves to get their own children. If they are unable to come, they must send a letter to the principal of the school stating that the parents of other children from the same reserve may bring them home. The children will not be allowed to go home on a train or a bus. The parents must bring the children back to the school strictly on time. If the children are not returned to school on time, they will not be allowed to go home the following Christmas year. I ask you to observe the regulations in order for this privilege of going home for Christmas that it may be continued from year to year. It will be a joy for you to have your children with you at Christmas. It will also be a joy for your children, and it'll bring added cheer and happiness to your home. Sincerely, Reverend F. O'Grady, the principal.
You can go back home to your community. I ask the community members to please turn your backs on the returning person. Please turn your backs on. This is to represent the isolation that was often experienced when people came home from residential school, such as not being able to speak your language, not relating to you or your family, or losing part of your identity. Everyone else with yellow cards, please find a spot nearby on the floor, but not on any of the blankets. You represent those students who left the school at about the age of 16, and your connection to your family and community were broken, and you never made it home. Some of you ended up in urban centers, others ended up in prison due to your experience at residential schools.
Please be silent for a moment to honor all those students who died, who were shunned or lost that connection to their family and community because of the residential schools. Please read scroll number 11.
You have to remember that the Canadian government has done a lot to Aboriginal people that was meant to make us become like Europeans. For example, in residential schools, my grandmother told me you couldn't speak our language or you'd get beaten. You couldn't see your parents, things like that. We didn't have voting rights for a long time. We also lost a lot of our culture. Heather, a Cree youth from a community in Saskatchewan.
In 1971, members of the Saddle Lake Cree Nation, Whitefish First Nation, Kehewan Cree Nation, and Frog Lake First Nation, along with other nations, had a sit and protest and occupied the Blue Quills Indian Residential School that is located just west of St. Paul. They peacefully took over the building and transformed it into the first Indigenous controlled education center in Canada. This inspired a movement across the country for Indian control over Indian education. Thousands of students have graduated from Blue Quills University, which now offers post-secondary programs and promotes pride in Indigenous culture and knowledge.
Thanks to the courage of survivors, Canadians started to find out about residential schools. Former students negotiated a settlement agreement that included the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2008. In 2008, the Prime Minister apologized for residential schools. Here is an excerpt. To the approximately 80,000 living former students and all family members and communities, the Government of Canada now recognizes that it was wrong to forcibly remove children from their homes. We apologize for having done this. We now recognize that it was wrong to separate children from rich and vibrant cultures and traditions. We apologize for having done this. Not only did you suffer these abuses as children, but as you became parents, you were powerless to protect your own children from suffering the same experience. And for this, we are sorry.
But apologizing means you have to change what you're doing. Many people are still waiting to see if Canada will change how it treats Indigenous children. The residential schools are just a part of the history. Children and grandchildren of people who went to the schools feel the impacts. Many former students are alive today, one here in our community. And many have felt the impacts and tell their stories to Canadians through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But Indigenous children are still treated differently. From schools, you don't get as much money. Today, you're even more likely to be taken from your communities, but this time you're being placed in foster care. Please read scroll number 12.
From the 1960s to the 1980s,
thousands of First Nations and Métis children were forced illegally from our homes and adopted or fostered, usually by non-Aboriginal people. This period is known as the 60s scope. Many of these kids experience violence, racism, and abuse and lost connection to their identity and culture. Like residential schools, the purpose of this 60s scope was assimilation.
You are forced to leave your community. Please find a spot on the floor nearby. You represent a child apprehended from your community during the 60s scoop. You were not able to reintegrate into your extended family and original community, leaving you with a sense of loss. As a result of the poorly constructed schools, the lack of proper clothing, and the poor diet you encountered at the residential school, many, many years later, you continue to suffer from various health conditions such as chronic bronchitis and diabetes.
Please read scroll 13.
Shannon Kustishin of Attawapaskat First Nation had a dream. Safe and comfy schools for First Nations, for First Nation children and youth, and classes that respect First Nation cultures. She worked tirelessly to convince the federal government to give First Nation children a proper education and a fair funding.
Please read scroll 14.
Shannon said, "I want to tell you what it is like to never have the chance to feel excited about being educated. It's hard to feel pride when our classrooms are cold and the mice run over our lunches and when you don't have proper resources like libraries and science labs. You know that kids in other communities have proper schools, so you begin to feel as if you are a child who doesn't count for anything. We want our younger brothers and sisters to go to school thinking that school is a time for hopes and dreams of the future. Every kid deserves this."
Shannon worked tirelessly to try to convince the federal government to give First Nations children a proper education. Unfortunately, she passed away in a car accident at the age of 15 before her dream would come true, but it did. on June 22, 2012, the day Shannon would have graduated, construction started for a new school in Attatawapiskat. The school opened in August 2014. The movement she started still lives on. It's called Shannon's Dream. Please unfold one corner of your blanket and give yourselves a round of applause for the young Indigenous leaders like Shannon who are bringing about positive change.
After you left residential school, you struggled to deal with the abuses you encountered. You eventually turned to drugs and alcohol, which led to unemployment and homelessness. You lived for years in the inner city streets of Edmonton, and the hard life you lived finally caught up to you. Family members were unaware of your passing and did not attend your funeral. Please have a seat.
Please read scroll number 15.
Broken promises. Over the years, more than 70% of the land set aside for us in the treaties has been lost or stolen, and big companies are allowed to make lots and lots of money from Indigenous lands and natural resources. We, the Indigenous peoples, get little, but the pollution from any of the companies that don't respect the earth and future generations are left to clean up the mess.
Please read scroll number 16.
First Nations are nations. First Nations treaty people signed over 300 treaties with the Europeans during the 1700s and 1800s. The treaties agreed to share the lands and resources with immigrants. Under existence legislations, treaty people are sovereign nations. The Indians surrendered over 99.9 million square kilometers of their land to the immigrants. Today, the sons of the immigrants have the largest treaty rights in Canada. The Indians have become the poorest people in Canada. Chief Pascal Big Hetty
Puckawagan.
First Nations.
One way the Canadian government pressures Indigenous peoples to leave their lands and assimilate is by failing to provide enough funds for basic services. Over half the drinking water systems on reserves pose a significant risk to human health. That's from the Office of the Auditor General in 2011. There are 85,000 new housing units needed on reserves, and 60% of existing houses are in need of repair. That is from the Assembly of First Nations in 2012. Rates of suicide are high in some First Nation communities and are even higher in many Inuit communities. Among First Nation communities, suicide rates are twice the national average, and they show no signs of decreasing. Suicide rates among the Inuit are even higher than among First Nations at 6 to 11 times the Canadian average. This is from the Public Health Agency of Canada in 2011.
Please read scroll number 17.
For many of us, women are the carriers of culture. By targeting women, you target the heart of the nation. Indigenous women have been targeted through federal legislation and policies that try to wear down our communities, and in doing so, make it easier to take our lands. Residential schools have left a legacy of violence that contributes directly to abuse, especially abuse directed at women and children. And in wider society, everyday racism causes wounds that are both visible and invisible. Indigenous women are at least 3.5 times as likely to experience violence as non-Indigenous women. Over 1,000 Indigenous women have gone missing or have been murdered since 1970s. And these are the only cases that have been documented. The real number is certainly much higher. 2014 reported by the RCMP.
Gender inequality in the Indian Act meant that Indigenous women who married a non-Indigenous man lost their legal Indian status, but a non-Indigenous woman who married an Indigenous man gained his status, Amendments have been made, but gender discrimination has not been fully removed from the Indian Act. In addition, if the father is not listed on the birth certificate, he is presumed by the Canadian government to be non-Indigenous.
You represent one of the women stripped of your status because of this gender inequality in the Indian Act. Because you married a non-First Nation man before 1985, and as a result, you've had to leave your community. Please find a spot on the nearby floor.
In 2007, a step was taken to improve the way Indigenous people are treated. The United Nations Declaration on the Human Rights of Indigenous People became a part of international law. This is an agreement among the world's governments that is a minimum standard to make sure Indigenous people survive and thrive. Canada was one of the last countries to agree to this declaration. Now we need to make sure it's put into action. Please unfold one small part of your blanket to honor those people who wrote the declaration and work to get it adopted, and give yourselves a round of applause. Despite the Government of Canada, a centuries of efforts to take away our identity, as Indigenous people, you have continued to resist and pass down your language and your ceremonies and much more. Please read scroll 18.
We have language immersion programs and healing initiatives based on our traditional values. Our elders are passing on land-based skills to our youth, and mothers and grandmothers are working to address violence in our nations by reinstating ceremonies that honor women. Our leaders are using the courts to have our rights recognized, and many of our nations are growing. We see treaties as living agreements that, if respected, will allow people from all backgrounds to share the land peacefully and respectfully. We are strong and resilient, having survived centuries of effort to make us disappear.
On June 1st, 2008, as part of the Indian Residential School Agreement and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada is launched. The mandate of the Commission is to inform Canadians about what happened at residential schools. The Commission traveled across Canada listening to survivors' stories and held 7 national events, including one in Edmonton, from March 27th to March 30th, 2014. In June 2015, the TRC released its final report, which documents the true history of the schools. It also releases 94 calls to action, which call on various organizations, including the government, the legal system, the education system, and the foster systems, to promote reconciliation. One of the positive legacies of the TRC is the creation of the National Centre of Truth and Reconciliation, located in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is a place of learning and dialogue where the truth of survivor experiences can be honored and kept safe for future generations. Please read scroll number 19.
To us, the answer is not about incremental change. It is not about just concrete action. It is also repairing the relationship. And the way to repair the relationship between us and Canada is to have this country acknowledge that its richness and its wealth come from their one-sided interpretation of the treaties. There has to be henceforth a double understanding of what those treaties represent. Ovid Mercredi, Crown First Nation Gathering, 2012.
After you return home from residential school, you eventually attended a post-secondary institution where you obtained a degree in law. You also sought out teachings from elders where you learned about your ceremonies, your culture, and much, much more. Later on, you embarked on a career as a lawyer to help fight for the rights of Indigenous people and for treaty rights. You continue to speak your language, attend ceremonies, be connected to your community, and walk between two worlds.
Please read scroll number 20.
The role of culture within the reconciliation process, I think, is that both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal cultures alike must respect one another in light of their historical experiences. They have to see eye to eye on healing, so to speak. By this, I mean that there needs to be maximized understanding and trust built between the cultures involved. David Johannessy from Kingate, Cape Dorset, Inuit community.
Despite the Canadian government of Canada's centuries of efforts to take away our identity, as Indigenous people, you have continued to resist and pass down your languages, ceremonies, and much more. Please read scroll 21.
Despite direct assimilation attempts, despite the residential school systems, despite the strong influence of the church in the Métis communities to ignore and deny our Aboriginal heritage, despite not having a land base, and despite our own diversity in heritage, we are still able to say we are proud to be Métis. We are resilient as a weed and beautiful as a wildflower. We have much to celebrate and be proud of. Christy Belcourt, Métis artist.
Please read scroll 22.
Our leaders need to show the way, but no matter how many deals and agreements they make, it is our daily conversations and interactions that our success as a nation in forging a better place will ultimately be measured. It is what we say to and about each other in public and in private that we need to look at changing. Honourable Justice Murray Sinclair, Chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada.
Scroll number 23, please.
In terms of this idea of guilt, we should know our history, and our history isn't very pretty. Here, but I can't answer for what happened 50 years ago. But if my grandchildren ask me what I did in my life in terms of this issue, and there hasn't been any improvement, then I certainly should feel guilt, and I don't think any Canadian wants to. Former Prime Minister Paul Martin.
But the violence of colonization has left a lot of pain, and all across Canada, the relationship between the Indigenous people and the newcomers is often broken. We don't need more broken promises. We need a new relationship, and we need real change. Good words and good ideas aren't enough. We need to take action together. We have lots of children, youth, adults to inspire us, lots from different backgrounds and communities. Let's join our efforts with them. This marks the end of your blanket activity. We ask you to look around at this point. There should be a few people standing on very small areas. And there shouldn't be that many blankets. We ask you to remember what it looked like when we first started and all the blankets were spread out. We ask you to hold these images in your mind in order to ensure that the end of our blanket exercise is affirming and uplifting, and we leave you in a good way. We want you to participate in a talking circle. This allows you to share your feelings and ask questions in a respectful way. And so, I never knew. We hear this comment quite often by Canadians who participated in our activity. They could find that they never knew about residential schools, which was government funded for more than 130 years. They never knew because the IRS and other impacts of colonialism were seldom taught in schools. Us, the Indigenous people, continue to suffer the abuse that 7 generations of Indigenous children experienced during this national project of assimilation. So this is why sharing is so important.